Hi, I'm Jess.
Hi, I'm Ryan, and you're listening to Your Therapist is Not Okay.
On today's episode, we're going to be asking and answering the question, can we heal narcissists and other personality disorders?
Hey, before we begin, we just want to let you know that we have another workshop that we're developing. We have had some listeners reach out to us about taking the psychodynamic theory workshop for therapists coming up next week, and folks are wondering, can I join if I'm not a therapist? Because of this, we've decided to develop a similar workshop for non therapists to understand themselves and relationships better, kind of understanding why they keep falling into similar roles like being the problem child, being the good child, being the helper, or the overachiever in every relationship that they're in. If you're interested in this workshop, and if there are specific things that you would want to cover in that workshop, please reach out to us at therapy@centeredself.ca or just head to our website. The link will be in the description box.
Narcissism, borderline personality disorder, and all the other personality disorders we'll be talking about today. There's a big question about whether or not they can be cured, or what do we do as therapists to quote unquote fix these disorders? This was brought up because Denise basically had seen a TikTok, and many like it, where somebody with BPD, borderline personality disorder, had a video of them saying that their therapist said they no longer have these symptoms and therefore they're cured of this personality disorder. And this client felt so good about this. This was a breakthrough for them, and they wanted to share it on social media.
Hearing about this, I kind of had some alarm bells. I really love that they felt good. They felt the sense of progress, maybe this sense of liberation from what had been a very difficult experience for them. But I was left wondering that this is an actual recording of a moment in a session, and I was kind of
Yeah.
feeling like, what is going on here? Where are the ethical boundaries? Is it really helpful to someone necessarily to make this claim?
Mm.
And was it the correct diagnosis in the first place? This was a young person in their 20s. Typically, that's not the time when we're going to see symptoms and the things that folks with personality disorders that are struggling with are not going to go away at that time necessarily. So I feel maybe a sense of concern around the professional dynamic.
Yeah, you were even wondering if that person might have been misdiagnosed.
Yeah, I did wonder that. Yeah. And that's something that I wonder anytime someone comes in with a diagnosis. I don't just like take it 100% for granted. I believe them and I hear them out, and I'm all also thinking like, is this the best fit? And when I say that, the most important part for a diagnosis for me is always, can this help the client? What does this diagnosis do to help the journey of therapy? Not just, can we slap a label on you? I don't like that mentality.
I 100% agree that even nowadays, we were talking about this before, that like we can almost use diagnostic labels as weapons to say that you're this person or you're this person. It does seem weird, doesn't it, that this kind of happened or Denise saw it. I can see it being helpful in certain
Mm,
situations. I think sometimes the fear that we're always going to be this way, or the fear that we're not good enough, we're bad, we're evil because of these diagnostic criteria, I could see it being incredibly enlivening to have somebody, your therapist, kind of show you that you're not going to be stuck like this. This isn't going to be your plight in life. Saying that you're cured is a bit of a misnomer, but I could see it feeling really good to hear that we've done the work. And I think potentially this ties into our podcast actually in season one, and really early podcast, where we
mm.
had this kind of feeling that fixed is kind of a misnomer, that we don't fix you in therapy, that you're not cured. No matter what you bring in life, there may be moments where it resurfaces or that some of this affect might come back. But there are definitely ways of being able to work with it, to be able to start to see where we might feel more control over some of the things that might have felt really uncontrollable before.
Mhm. And we're going to get into that a lot more today too. And but I love what you're saying that like we can celebrate progress, celebrate growth without necessarily having to say like the diagnosis is gone or anything like that. And if that really is a super healing moment for someone, it's not really for me to say, no, you shouldn't have that. That's not for me to say. It is, that's not typically going to be the way that I work with personality disorders, because that's not how personality disorders work, in my opinion. But we're going to talk a little bit more about like some of that, what that diagnostic stuff looks like today.
Actually, let's dive in right now to it. You know a lot more about this because in the States, diagnostic criteria are something pretty big that everyone, including psychotherapists, have to work with. I'm an expert in BPD, but you'll know a lot more about kind of the DSM, our diagnostic criteria manual. So tell me, Ryan, like what are personality disorders? Let's just jump in.
Okay. Yeah. Let's do it. And that's like, as Jess was saying, like to practice therapy in the States, you have to do diagnosis. It's required by pretty much every state board. It's required anytime you want to get insurance covered. It's actually not something that psychotherapists can do in Canada, or at least in Ontario. And similarly in the UK, it's not something that therapists do either. So like those are some points of comparison that have a different system around mental health. I first of all I have my DSM right in front of me today. It's not my
Yeah.
favorite book in the world. It can be a helpful guide to kind of understand and speak the language around these things. But I'm just telling you that I have it in front of me to remind every practitioner that like this is not something that you need to memorize and always know, and it's better to have a reference and double check. Um, like you never want someone prescribing you something and say, I'm pretty sure that's the dose. Look it up, mama. I don't want any pretty sures.
Good,
Um,
good due diligence.
thank you, thank you. So one of the biggest things about any type of personality disorder is that it's an enduring pattern of inner experience and outward behavior. And it deviates from the individual's culture, right? So built into that, there's cultural considerations. There are things in one culture that might seem narcissistic that in another culture would not, because it doesn't deviate from the social norm within that society or culture. Um, and it has to manifest in a couple different ways. It can be in cognition, as in with thinking, and affectivity, the way that you display your emotion. It can be in interpersonal functioning, how we are in relationships. And it can also have to do with impulse control. Can you stop yourself from doing things that you think, basically?
Mhm.
Um, and so this is part of my catch with that TikTok video is that it is basically pervasive across a broad range of situations across life, typically starting in teen years and continuing onwards. It's not a personality disorder if it doesn't lead to clinically significant distress. Basically, nothing is a diagnosis if it doesn't lead to clinically significant distress,
Yeah.
um, or impairment in various situations. So it has to be able to be traced back to adolescence or early adulthood. So you can't develop a personality disorder for your in your 40s or something, for example. You could be diagnosed for the first time if
Yeah.
you're able to work with whoever's diagnosing you and make those connections to early events. And it has to be not better explained by something else. So
Mm,
if you just started taking a new medication and you
yeah.
suddenly, quote, have a personality disorder, you might want to look into whether or not there could be side effects from a medication or if it could be related to recreational substance use, things like that. So you're always looking for other explanations. Differential diagnosis is what we would call that, is you're looking for what are the other things that could look like this.
Mhm.
And then at least for me, the ethos is that you want to start with a diagnosis that is kind of the least restrictive, so to speak. So that like, okay, while we're continuing to work together and learn more and make more connections, we're going to say this is anxiety because you
Um,
do have the symptoms of anxiety and
but
there
you may
might be
not have
more going on.
Yeah.
Right. So
Mhm.
we start with something gradual. And unlike personality disorders, most other mental disorders have are only applicable as long as the symptoms are present.
Yeah.
So they do. quote, go away. Although, as we'll talk about today, that's not necessarily what we see in practice or what people experience either.
Yeah.
And that kind of links with what we think about healing.
Mm,
I'll just mention a few types of personality disorders. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this. We're going to mostly talk about narcissism and borderline personality disorders because those are kind of the ones that Jess specializes in BPD. I've worked with it quite a bit, and our producer Denise kind of brought the theme in question around narcissism. And these are both very kind of, as I think we've mentioned before, like these are kind of trending topics. People are talking about these a lot.
yeah.
People are being diagnosed with these maybe more than they were in the past. There's a little more awareness around it. So we have borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. Almost feels kind of old-fashioned, but it is still a diagnosis that's basically about really big emotional displays in reaction to occurrences that the display of emotionality does not really seem on par with the
Yeah.
event that occurred, in short. Schizotypal involves a lot of magical thinking and kind of feeling like special and unique. You might feel like you're a chosen person and kind of some spiritual orientation. So there's lots of stuff kind of comes up with that. Some of it, when I read that, I'm like, this reads to me a little bit like a cult leader in a
Yep.
sense. That's like I'm a messiah or I'm a messenger from whatever spiritual path. Then there's OCPD, which is a little different than OCD. Um, Both of them are about the obsessive compulsive tendencies that someone might have. OCPD is more of a broad picture of life and less about the specific kind of ritual and obsessions. So they do actually present pretty differently. And in fact, when most people throw around OCD carelessly about like, oh, you're very OCD, all your shoes are in order by the door, not a diagnostic criteria for OCD. um, that kind of pop media representation of it is actually more like OCPD.
Mm,
Um, there's antisocial personality disorder. It's an interesting one that fascinates a lot of people because it has also at times been referred to or linked to as sociopathy, psychopathy, or historically dissocial personality. And essentially, this is about a pervasive sense, 15, I think they say, clear, pervasive demonstration of not caring about or believing in the rights of others. So that's where you might see like a lot of manipulation, a lot of harming someone to meet an ends and not feeling any kind of remorse about it.
mhm,
There's dependent personality disorder, which is about kind of really needing someone for emotional support to the degree that you would kind of do anything to maintain that connection. That's one that actually does kind of show up in the therapy office fairly often as well. Um, there is a narcissistic personality disorder, which we'll talk about more. And then there are others too. Paranoid personality disorder, where we're looking at kind of that always being suspicious and mistrustful of other people. There's avoidant personality disorder, where avoiding conflict and difficult situations and relationships becomes a primary marker of who you are. And then I will just admit that there's another one that I know very little about, and that's schizoid. Not one that I've had to look at for a long time. So I won't pretend to have expertise that I don't. And one big takeaway that we both wanted to kind of share and reiterate, especially after talking about antisocial and narcissistic and schizotypal that are kind of linked with things that we've seen a lot in popular media, like cult leaders and sociopathy. If you have a personality disorder diagnosis, you're not evil. You're not
no.
wrong. You're not bad.
I think that that's one of the things that creates this misconception that somehow progress means, or the goals in therapy that we were talking about in this season, means that somehow if you're not this thing anymore, then you've made progress. Just because this spans the lifespan or that it's pervasive doesn't mean, first of all, that you can't have help. And
Mhm.
also doesn't mean that you are a bad person or that people shouldn't be with you. You're not evil. In fact, a lot of times there's real traceable reasons why these things can come up. And we just have our heart set on some of these very specific ones. Like probably a lot of them you haven't heard about, but you'll have heard about, let's say, antisocial because you'll like have seen some true crime podcasts where they might throw out the term sociopath or psychopath. You might have
Mm.
heard about narcissism because you think your boyfriend was a narcissist, or borderline has become, it used to be very, like, it used to be pretty silent, but now it's become pretty popular because of social media. And none of these things are necessarily the way that the media or even social media will say them to be. When you really read into them, you'll understand the amount of criteria that it would take to be any one of these things. As you said, for example, with antisocial, like up to 15 criteria that you would actually have to meet in order to have this diagnosis. And it wouldn't be the very first thing diagnosed. We're just always looking for a reason for certain behaviors that often will grab a hold of the few salient ones to create this
Mm.
diagnostic category for somebody. Um, and often there's a lot of reasons why. You and I were talking about this a lot, and we both kind of really agree with the fact that there's a comorbidity to this. There's more than one reason why these personality disorders might show up. And for one, it's chemical imbalance. A lot of research has shown that certain personality disorders may have different chemical imbalances in the brain, which is funny because our brain is always changing. There's always different chemicals. Ryan gives me a compliment, I'm going to feel super good. My chemistry just got changed, as you were saying before.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's kind of this tendency that we have right now to, and comes and goes, but we want to be able to say basically like, I have depression because of my brain chemistry.
Yeah.
That's not untrue,
Nope.
but it's not the case that your brain chemistry is always one way. It changes all the time, and your brain chemistry may be explained by formative experiences that you've had and the ways that you relate with folks.
Yep.
It's not separate from your
Yes.
experience or your consciousness.
No.
It's that kind of like othering from the body and the brain
Yeah.
that never kind of sits quite well with me because I want people to be able to be their total selves, not split themselves up and say like the brain's the bad guy.
Yep.
Brain's not the bad guy. You are the brain.
You are the brain.
You
And
are the
also,
brain. Sounds like a compliment, doesn't it?
I think another one that can come up a lot that I see in my office almost always is environment.
Mhm.
Um, and how certain situations might have then either influenced brain chemistry can influence that. There's a chicken and egg thing there when it comes to that. But when we're talking about experiences as psychotherapists who've been in the field for 15 years, environment for me, especially in working with borderline personality disorder, has never not been there. It's never just been this is the chemical or genetics, for example, is another one that gets brought up that this is just in my family. When it comes to how we were raised, the trauma that we might have faced, this all kind of creates this comorbid aspect of where some of these might be showing up. And if we only pay attention to one, as Ryan just said perfectly, we're not getting the whole picture.
Mm.
And we might actually not be seeing all of you and giving you some of the credence for resilience. I think borderline personality disorder, in my opinion, is a very resilient personality disorder.
For sure.
And to create it as evil would really mean to take away some of the really important factors that BPD also has, like being able to be highly sensitive of their surroundings, watching people. I've never met someone with BPD that doesn't know how to read someone's emotions to see how safe they are.
Mm. For sure. And what I would think about the genetics, what I've learned is essentially that um, geneticists can determine someone's kind of predisposed based on their family's past to develop a particular mental disorder, maybe to develop an addiction. These things are predispositions, and then the environment determines whether it's expressed pretty often. And there is with that some debate within the scientific community about like, so can we really say that you are that much more likely to say develop schizophrenia because your family has history of schizophrenia, or are you more likely to develop schizophrenia if you're raised by someone who's experiencing schizophrenia? And so there's always these kind of like, because these are descriptive things, because we're not inducing schizophrenia and then saying like how do we make that happen, because that would be evil.
Yeah.
um to just induce people with disorders for the research of it all.
Yeah.
um and then when we talk about comorbidity, we're talking also really about when two mental health things show up at the same time. This is actually a really common way to look at personality disorders. Some people will say you have a personality disorder and it has features of these things. So it's very often that someone will be diagnosed and told like you have features of narcissistic and dependent personality disorder or something like that. Some combination of those traits. And it's also very common to have that comorbidity where maybe you have BPD and you're also diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, or you're also diagnosed with um, complex PTSD. Um, and I think in both Jess and I's opinion, like most of these things really have a lot of their roots in traumatic experiences anyway. So PTSD makes a lot of sense along the trajectory of that.
I think we should also say that almost all of us have traits of some of these things.
Hmm.
Like I have traits of BPD, I have traits of schizotypical. And like I one time took a thing, it's like, I do think I'm special. Maybe I could be a really good cult leader. I don't know. Haven't tried. And it doesn't mean that we are these things. When I was working at a psychology firm, we would sometimes do these tests to kind of see where someone's falling. It'd be really shocking to see that we might have met a couple criteria for some of these things. In fact, that's really normal. And actually, me telling clients, I'm like, oh, yeah, I have these too. This makes us human. That, like, there aren't these perfect humans walking around that are completely devoid of some of these qualities. And so, actually, to give a little bit of credence, let's say, to that boyfriend that might have had narcissism, in our opinion, maybe could have checked off a couple of those boxes. It takes quite a bit to be diagnosed with a personality disorder. And while we might all have some traits of this, I think that helps normalize a personality disorder rather than make them, again, this other world, like other thing. And we might see a couple traits in somebody, it still doesn't make them this other thing.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of brings us nicely to thinking more about narcissism and kind of as you're saying that, I'm thinking that one thing that when a client comes in and says to me, these people in my life are narcissists, my dad's a narcissist, my ex is a narcissist, um, I often think like that's in a way an easy out to say like my problem is this other person. Now, I'm not saying that in any kind of a blaming way, but it kind of does create this device where you can distance yourself from the problem. And maybe someone was very much showing those traits, like Jess was saying, and like they have some little bit of truth. But labeling them as a narcissist is kind of like creating this diagnosis that means it's not my fault.
Mhm.
And as a therapist, I'm not typically looking for whose fault is it. I'm looking
Oh,
for how can you heal from this? How can we create more self-understanding, better management of your day-to-day mental health? Maybe avoiding that situation in the future. And to do that, we're going to need to understand how maybe you were a part of it. And I would never want to do it in a way that felt like someone was being blamed for trauma that they experienced, especially if they were assaulted or abused in any way. Um, but I do still want to work with them about how can we keep ourselves safe in the future, um, and avoid kind of doing that again.
we've talked a bit about how we replay certain aspects of our past in the present. That's one of our big tells. I'm sure Denise has it on one of her bingo cards of like what we always talk about in session or in podcasts. But I think that that really comes up importantly in what you're saying, Ryan, about this dynamic that happens.
Hmm.
Often somebody that might have certain traits might become actually much more comfortable to be with because we know how to react to them or we know what our role is. That's a wonderful aspect of seeing how there might be a why attached to this and how we can take control and maybe break some of these patterns that we might have learned how to relate to from an early age.
Hmm.
And it also allows us to think about where abuse comes in or how abuse can come into a relationship and how we might not immediately have red flags if we haven't been taught how to have those.
Hmm.
And so in our office, we're not necessarily going to be diagnosing someone else who we've never met, but we can take you at face value to be like, how were you impacted by what you were seeing in this relationship? And how did that maybe stem from certain ways that you want to grow from, heal from, and maybe not have this happen ever again?
Hmm. Absolutely. Makes me think of something else that Denise was sharing with us about, like, if two people came, a parent and a kid, or a couple came to therapy, and someone discovered that, like, oh, there's abuse happening in this relationship, what would we do? Would we kind of lean into that and label that as abuse? That's a really complicated question in a lot of ways. One thing that comes up for me, those folks that I know that work a lot with couples, if there's active abuse, they say we're not doing couples therapy. It's contraindicated to kind of make this feel like it's okay. That's going to be more of a separate therapy kind of thing until there's enough stability in the relationship, um, that the abuse is not actively happening. And then maybe there can be some couples therapy. But there's nothing therapeutic about an abusive relationship. I guess I'm kind of thinking, like, when we hear about abuse and narcissism, where do we go from there?
I think one of the big questions that comes up for anybody in our office that might have a personality disorder, narcissism or otherwise, or anybody that um, is kind of thinking about this is, can we fix it? Is it
Mm.
fixable? And you've kind of already answered that question by looking at the DSM to kind of see that it's pervasive. But I think that that's maybe not the actual goal. Just like it wouldn't be to necessarily never have anxiety again with a personality disorder, if it's a correct diagnosis, this might be something you're going to be living with. What if the goal was finding mental health practices that actually suit, navigating daily occurrences of how this comes up, looking at the past, understanding our whys, and creating this self awareness that can then get to the root of where some of these triggers are?
Mhm.
We'll talk about this, I think, when we talk about treating personality disorders, but I think that one of the big things is that recognizing that just because this won't be fixed doesn't mean that all is lost. And this is where I think therapy really comes in an important way, because while we may not be able to necessarily fix the predisposition that you might have, while psychotherapists definitely won't be able to necessarily fix the chemicals without an intervention of maybe a medication or something else, looking into the environmental factors, navigating the trauma that might have happened in childhood, understanding some of those real impacts that have happened really can help an affect regulation. And what I mean by that is using Ryan's example of histrionic, when we don't want to have a huge reaction to a small trigger. How do we learn strategies of being able to tell ourselves, I don't want to go here, and not having our reaction take over? Those things can, and I've seen it in my office, be helped in therapy.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and it's also going to be an important thing to work with that and figure out, you know, we all have this essential narcissism. It's part of being a person. We all have these traits, right? And like Jess was saying, like, actually the threshold to describe that as a personality disorder is extremely high.
Mhm.
Um, which is not to say that, if you do have that criteria that all is lost. It's not all lost. You can still heal, you can still grow, you can still learn how to manage these things. And in fact, there are moments in which, as a therapist, I recognize, like, am I almost encouraging narcissism in a way? Because we do want our clients to think about themselves, consider how they're doing, make choices that are in their own best interest. And there are times in which someone else might describe that as narcissism. Like, oh, well, they, didn't want to come to my party because it reminds them of this thing that they don't like. How selfish of them. It's kind of narcissistic. And if I'm that person's therapist, I'm thinking, hey, you held a boundary.
Yep.
Job. Like you can't do birthday parties because it's a triggering experience for you. I'm glad you did that and communicated it to your friend.
I think that's exactly the opposite of narcissism, being able to hold a boundary and be selfish. These are great things that we're actually being aware of the impact we might have on somebody. And probably we've crossed that boundary over and over and over again. So therapy might actually be actually loving the word selfish.
Hmm.
A lot of times when people come with a personality disorder in my office, specifically BPD, because that's what I specialize in, a lot of times the big fear is, can I actually get better? And you know what? I say yes, actually. I say a resounding yes. Being able to look at some of these factors that have impacted us can allow us to realize it's not monolithic. I've never really seen BPD show up the exact same way to every single client.
Hmm.
I don't think any of them do. And for me, there's so many different manifestations. There might be aggression towards another. There might be aggression towards the self. There might be promiscuity. There might be compulsive spending. All of these are different categories that you can probably see when you're looking at BPD. And almost all of them come from some sort of root. And depending on the trauma, depending what happens. And to watch us get to the root means that that kind of affect and how we're displaying it can already start to be tended to because we already feel a little bit more control. And for me, I think that this is where my role as psychodynamic can be really helpful because I'm not treating it just as this monolithic personality disorder that it's a catch-all. I'm looking at the specifics. I'm looking at the trauma. I'm wondering about this. It means that the relationship is already becoming manifest because I'm not treating them like their diagnosis. I'm treating them like a
Hmm.
person that has had a past. And that has been incredible because that relationship, as it gets formed, means that trust is building. And that trust, when it's built, means that we can start to go deeper into some of these things and then navigate new forms of relating. And it often can happen right in the therapy room.
Hmm. I mean, I so strongly agree with what you're saying, Jess, too, about like, am I reticent about the like your quote cured kind of language? Yes. However, I am very resoundingly confident that like, yes, you can get quote better. You can kind of go on a healing journey. You can cope with day-to-day life better. You can make meaningful changes to the way you show up in relationships and the way you show up for yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and a cool thing that trust building that Jess was describing allows us to offer as therapists is kind of a different example of being in a relationship than some of the traumatic experiences may have had early on, to where you can maybe get mad at us
Yep.
and have us not lash out at you or
Mm,
abandon you or judge you for being upset. You can have maybe even kind of blow up, so to speak, at us and have us sit through that with you and say like, what's going on for you? I've noticed you have the really big reaction to this. And I'm wondering if you're feeling hurt by something. And it allows exploration with a confidence that we can repair the damage that has been done in this relationship. And that's often something that people don't get, especially if they have big reactions to things that might alienate others
yeah.
and push them away. Like if you tell, someone in your life that they can go fuck themselves and that you hate them, A natural response to that is usually to take some space. Either a lot of space forever or a little space for a while. And in therapy, we have the gift of being able to sit through it and not run away.
And that might be the very first time you've ever felt that.
Yeah.
Being able to see how some of these things manifest and us hold them. And
Hmm.
maybe say, what would it have been like for us to do that differently? What would it be like? What caused you to want that push away from me?
Hmm.
What happens that I'm still here? And often I notice that that's usually when tears come because there's a
Mm.
real vulnerability sometimes when it comes to that lashing out, that there's actually a deeper meaning behind it than what's actually on the surface of being said. And being able to create that repair, as you perfectly said, is a huge part of therapy. And that, what we usually call in the field transference, which is how you're using us, and countertransference, how I'm seeing you, can actually be very reflective of the outside world. But we can then start to form something different together, which you will immediately see
Hmm.
outside of the therapy room. It doesn't just stay in here when you've started to discover something important of yourself. It's why I really don't love things that just stay on the surface of saying, you need to do this one thing and you'll be cured, or go through this workbook and you'll be cured, can be very helpful. Oh my goodness. Yes. But getting to the root of it often can mean that those things are going to happen naturally. And we're creating corrective internal experiences with somebody that you trust that can actually then mean that, yeah, you might not be displaying some of these criterions that you were before.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I really love that those aha moments that are almost kind of like a jaw drop. And to be clear, that's not most sessions. We've said that before. Most sessions we're just kind of like muddling through it together. But you will have these realizations sometimes where you're like, wait, have I done this in every significant relationship I've ever had? And you kind of have that moment of like, oh, I can track it. And then, like Jess was saying, like go through your daily life and be like, oh, wow, I am literally about to do that thing again. And now I can choose something a little different. There's a little space around that. So I can see what I'm about to do, maybe do it and then correct it, or maybe decide I'm not going to do it. I feel like pushing this person away because I'm scared by how much I need them. I'm going to go sit alone for 15 minutes and then decide what to do.
Mm. I often talk about this as path building.
Mm.
That when we are so used to particular experiences with somebody, could be caregivers from an early age, this is what kept me safe. And we learn that over time. Let's use this example of pushing someone away, saying, fuck you, I don't want to see you again. This can be a way of us actually secretly really wanting this person to hold on tighter, but it also has kept us safe. And we do it again and we do it again. And what really therapy is about is actually forging something new. In neuropsych, they would talk about different pathways of the brain. I like paths because it's harder to build a path, right? Where it's a well-worn, kind of like trodden, maybe even like concrete path that's like much simpler. Or now we're like cutting through the woods to try to create something new. That's helpful to remember when we go back to an old behavior. If we get triggered and then we do something again that might have been representative of 2 years ago.
Right.
I think one of the big things I would say to that I think is really important is that, of course you did,
Hmm.
because that trigger means that it's easier to do this response than to keep doing the work.
Hmm.
It doesn't mean the work is gone. It means that it was easier to do this old response. And the work was actually you recognizing it, bringing it back to therapy and working on it again. And maybe this is helpful when you think about personality disorders, because while we might still have this other path that's quite paved, quite comfortable to walk on, we're forging a new path in therapy, but that other one's still there.
Yeah. Yeah. And because of its presence, like I would say it's almost inevitable that that's going to happen at some point. And so as much as I talk about wanting to prevent it from happening by building in some space, building in some timeout, it's also going to happen. So it's just as important, like Jess said, to think, how am I going to handle when it does happen? How can I still be loving towards myself despite making a mistake? How can I write it down and remember to take it back to therapy? And yeah, healing is not about doing it right every time. Sometimes it's about the most glorious fuck up ever that
Yeah.
you learn a ton from.
I think there's such an obvious fear that when that happens, we haven't made any quote unquote progress in therapy.
Mm.
I think realizing that sometimes the easiest option is not going to be the healthiest. And it was this one time and you clocked it, whereas so many other times it was just the response.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yep. I really love thinking about things this way and thinking about, like, you know what? It's not about just doing it right every time. It's not perfect. It's in a lot of ways, thinking about this part of therapy is really what brought us to make this podcast, right? So we're not okay. We didn't figure it out, even though we've had years of therapy and we've trained as therapists and all this stuff. It doesn't mean that we don't fall back into our shitty patterns.
Yes.
That it doesn't mean that every time we give a client advice, we take our own advice, because I sure don't.
Nor do you take mine. I'm just going.
And why would I?
I love that actually. I want you to hear that. I think for myself, like that aspect of anger was a real safety for me. And it's so rare for that to happen now, for me to lash out. But when
Mhm.
I do, it's important for me to recognize, yeah, I'm not fixed. There isn't going to be an end all to being human. When it comes to personality disorders, it's helpful to realize that, yes, there's always going to be help that you can do if you're doing the work and forging
Mhm.
that path. Unfortunately, it's incredibly difficult work, but that's mental health. It's worth it, but it's tricky.
Absolutely.
Will they be something that becomes less of a burden? Yes, if we do the work.
Yes. Yeah. And I want to thank all our listeners for listening to us and letting us kind of do the work with you.
Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.